Alright, this is the mini lesson on figurative language. And as you know from class, I love this mini lesson. And you mustn't forget that figurative language is really of the utmost importance. I'd like to think of figurative language sort of like having a car when you're in high school. You can live without it, but life just isn't as much fun. So let's jump in. Figurative language. It's a language which cannot be taken literally since it was written to create a special effect or feeling. And typically in class I have students ask this question, well, what does that mean? Okay, well, literal language is if you were to say something and you say exactly what you mean, we call that literal language. So very often the language sometimes of science is very literal because it needs to be exact. All right, that pen is a length of exactly 6.5 inches. Very literal. Where you can figurative language, you would say, oh, that pen's gigantic. It's like the size of a carrot. Okay, and you're comparing it to a carrot, and so it uses the imagination. And when we think about, well, what do people like about figurative language? It's just that. It's that it engages the imagination and allows us to think in a creative way, and we find that enjoyable. Alright, so types of figurative language we'll be covering in this mini lesson are the simile, metaphors, personification, which is really a type of metaphor, and then hyperbole. To start with, the simile. It's a comparison of two unlike things in which a word of comparison, such as like or as, is used. And using like or as, that's the key. So when you need to look, and I'm going to ask you, well, what's a simile, what's a metaphor? Understanding that if it has like or as, it's a simile, that's one of the key ways to distinguish it. This little graphic here, this is sort of how I like to visualize a simile. Okay, we have one element and it's being compared with a second element, and the quality that makes them similar. Okay, those are the important things to identifying a simile. Let's go with an example. She stood in front of the altar shaking like a freshly caught trout. So element 1 is the person standing in front of the altar, which is the bride. Element 2 is the trout. Not only that, but the freshly caught trout. Now, you'd never think to perhaps compare a bride to a trout, and I highly recommend you don't go up to a bride on her wedding day and say, well, you look like a trout. Trust me, I speak from experience. But you should never compare the two. But in this case, the comparison works because you can find a similar quality, and that is they're both shaking, they're both nervous. The trout, because it's out of water and will can't get a breath in because it's out of water, so it will die, and it's nervous about its life. And the bride is about to make a commitment for the rest of her life to one person, and so is probably very nervous about this very big day. Okay, so remember, it's a comparison of two unlike things in which a word of comparison such as like or as, and that's the key, like or as has to be used. Metaphors. Let's talk about metaphors. First metaphor we're going to talk about, and there are several we will talk about, is called a direct metaphor, and it directly compares the two unlike things by the use of a verb such as is. So that's the important part. It could be was as well, but it uses this verb to compare the two things. Again, let's use our little graphic here to see what's the similar quality between the two elements. And his face is a blue moon pocked with craters. So his face, right, is being compared to a blue moon. And what's the similar quality? Both have sort of a rough surface, okay? So sort of saying maybe the boy, his face has acne, and it looks a lot like a moon pocked with craters, okay? It's rough surface. That is a direct metaphor. Now, if you want to change that to a simile, you would say his face is like a blue moon pocked with craters. Okay, and that is not as powerful. To say his face is a blue moon, that's why we use a direct metaphor. It creates sort of a stronger punch to it, or has a stronger punch to it. Okay, let's look at the implied metaphor. This implies or suggests the comparison between the two things without actually stating it directly. Again, same graph that we use with the simile and the direct metaphor works over here. We're always looking for what are the two things being compared and what's the similar quality. But you'll notice that over here, element 2 is implied, which means it won't be stated in the sentence directly. Let's take a look. Shut your trap. So we know that element 1 is going to be the trap. And element 2, we've heard this common expression, and we know what that means. It means shut your mouth. Therefore, trap is really being compared to mouth. And the similar quality as well, both will get you into trouble if you keep them open and keep them moving, right? A trap can get you into trouble, and so can a mouth. But mouth is not written there, so therefore, it is implied. Here are two examples of the same comparison. Can you tell which is a direct metaphor and which is implied? Okay, the city sleeps peacefully. The city is a sleeping woman. Well, if you said that the city sleeps peacefully is the implied metaphor, you are correct, because the city is a sleeping woman. That is the direct metaphor. And you can see in this example that, the city sleeps peacefully suggests that it's being compared with something that also sleeps. All right? The city is a sleeping woman tells you what it's being compared with. The woman is in the sentence, and that's why it's direct. So it's a good way to sort of see the difference. There it is. City equals a sleeping woman. In this case, the city sleeps peacefully, and peacefully would be the quality.